Fate. The cafe on the corner of Maple and Elm had always been a favorite spot for Sophie. It was quaint, with mismatched furniture and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee that seemed to wrap around you like a warm blanket. The kind of place where time slowed down, allowing the world outside to blur while the one inside sharpened into focus. She sat at her usual table by the window, a cup of tea steaming gently in front of her. Outside, the autumn leaves danced in the wind, their vibrant reds and golds swirling in a symphony of color. Sophie loved this time of year, when the world seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a delicate balance between the end of something old and the beginning of something new. Her eyes wandered across the room, landing on a young couple huddled together in the corner, their heads bent close in whispered conversation. A pang of wistfulness tugged at her heart. It had been a long time since she had shared a moment like that with someone. Sophie had always been a believer in fate, in the idea that life had a way of bringing the right people into your life at the right time. But lately, that belief had begun to waver. At 35, she found herself questioning whether she had missed her chance, if maybe fate had passed her by while she was too busy with her career, with her family, with everything except finding someone to share her life with. She sighed, taking a sip of her tea as she turned her gaze back to the window. The world outside was a blur of motion, people rushing by, each one lost in their own story. She wondered if any of them had found what she was still searching for. Just then the door to the cafe swung open, and a gust of wind swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something familiar. Sophie's eyes flicked toward the door, and her breath caught in her throat. A man stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. He was tall, with dark hair that was slightly tousled from the wind, and eyes that seemed to hold a depth of emotion that could only come from having lived through the highs and lows of life. There was something about him that tugged at a memory deep within her, something she couldn't quite place. As he moved further into the cafe, their eyes met, and in that instant, the world seemed to stop. Recognition flickered in his gaze, and for a moment, it was as if they were the only two people in the room. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she searched her memory. Where had she seen him before? Then it hit her, the airport, 5 years ago. She had been waiting for a flight to Paris, a trip she had planned for months. He had been there too, standing a few feet away, his expression tense as he spoke into his phone. She remembered thinking he looked out of place, his suit rumpled, his tie askew, as if he had rushed to the airport at the last minute. Their flight had been delayed, and they had ended up sitting near each other in the crowded terminal. He had noticed the book she was reading, a classic novel she had packed to pass the time. They had struck up a conversation, talking about literature, travel, and life. There had been an instant connection, a sense that they had known each other for much longer than the brief time they had shared. But just as quickly as it had started, it had ended. The flight had finally been called, and in the rush of boarding, they had been separated. She had looked for him once they landed, but he was nowhere to be found. She had boarded her connecting flight to Paris with a strange sense of loss, wondering what might have been. Now, here he was, standing just a few feet away from her in this small cafe. Sophie could hardly believe it. Fate, it seemed, had brought them back together. The man hesitated for a moment, then walked over to her table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice as warm and familiar as she remembered. "But I couldn't help but notice. Haven't we met before?" Sophie smiled, feeling a surge of hope and excitement that she hadn't felt in years. "Yes," she replied softly, "I believe we have." He smiled back, a look of relief and recognition in his eyes. "I'm Michael," he said, extending his hand. "Sophie," she replied, taking his hand in hers. They stood there for a moment, the noise of the cafe fading into the background as they reconnected. There was so much to say, so many questions to ask, but for now just being there together was enough. As they sat down to talk, the autumn leaves continued to swirl outside, a reminder that while time might move forward, some moments are meant to circle back. In that small cafe, as the rain pattered against the windows, Sophie realized that fate had not forgotten her after all. It had simply been waiting for the right moment.